You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the BioHealth Capital Region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Welcome to another edition of BioTalk. I'm Rich Bendis, CEO of BioHealth Innovation and your host. And we haven't done this much, but we have a repeat performer today. And the reason for that is there's a lot going on in the BioHealth Capital Region. And one of our leading organizations in this region is also engaged in a lot of new activities, which we're going to talk about. Also, more importantly, US Pharmacopeia and Dr. Ron Piervincenzi, its CEO, has become a new board member of BioHealth Innovation in the past year in 2021 with Tony Lakovich, one of its senior VPs, serving on the BHI board. So we have a much closer relationship and understanding of each other today than we did a year ago. So we have a lot to talk about. Ron, welcome to BioTalk again.
Thank you, Rich. It's a pleasure. And you're right. We've really made quite a journey since that discussion we had a year ago. And I dare say the discussion played a part in that.
Yeah, I think it did, because I thought we talked about at the end of that discussion that we needed to talk a little more deeply about ways we could work together. And guess what? We are. And at the end of this, we're also going to, one of the topics we're going to talk about is a way that we can partner on some events together. And we'll be talking to the audience and not telling the audience about that now. We'll keep them engaged for the next 30 minutes so they'll stay till the end to know what those events are going to be.
I think it's great, Rich. But I said something about biohealth innovation. We all hear the same thing all the time. Oh, we'll catch up, we'll figure out these ways to work together. And most of the time, nothing happens. Not the case here. And I think that actually bodes really well for not just biohealth, but the region itself.
Well, thank you very much. And it really takes active participants. It takes two to tango, as they say. And I think we found a way that we can dance together. So let's start. And there's probably a numerous listeners who were not involved in listening to our first BioTalk a year ago. So Ron, if you don't mind, do a brief introduction of yourself and your background so everybody understands how you got to become the CEO of USP.
Yeah, happy to. And I dare say, I hope that most listeners have been busy enough the last year, they haven't been trying to remember my backstory. My training is in biomedical engineering. I have my Ph.D. at Duke in protein engineering. So I've always been fascinated with the crossover between science and production engineering. But upon completion of my Ph.D., I made a bit of a turn and I decided to work in the healthcare space, but through management consulting at McKinsey & Company, based in New Jersey. I was based in New Jersey. And I ended up there a long time through election to partner, working in R&D across biotech and pharma globally. Probably half my work was outside the US and about half was inside. Through that work, not only did I learn quite a bit, but I also learned to appreciate the nuances of the pharmaceutical industry, but also some of its shortcomings. I craved something different. After McKinsey, I worked at Biogen for a while up in Boston, but then soon found my dream opportunity at USP, working in a nonprofit organization dedicated right within science and health, right at that same cusp, but looking at the entirety of the industry from a different perspective. And that brought me back down to the DC area. I had started my science career working in the Naval Research Lab in DC, actually. So I said, bring back down. That was even before graduate school. And then landing back here where USP sits in between government, industry, and practitioners in our region, that's not actually that unusual. But in most of the world, it's a pretty unusual spot to sit.
Yeah, I think we're fortunate in the BioHealth Capital Region that we basically have all of those players, including academia, which is very rich as well, right in our backyard. So rather than having to get on planes or trains, we basically get in a car and drive to go see somebody rather than having to make that journey across the country, which people in Boston or down in San Francisco would have to do to interact. So we do have a distinct advantage in our region. And it's nice to have you with your global headquartered here right off of Rockville Pike in Twin Brook.
I can tell you, Rich, the very short version of our story. So USP turned 202 3 weeks ago as of our recording.
Wow.
Our story began in 1820. The 11 physicians got together to try to solve the problem of poor quality medicine in the US at the time. A lot of it was being dumped on our shores from Europe, especially the UK. The problem here in the US is we had no system at all, and everybody was making medicine differently, buying it from abroad with no way to set an expectation of what it should look like. Long story short, these physicians came together, decided we should create our own standard in the US. It was a new country. And the notion of a national pharmacopeia was actually the first in the world. And they created this, essentially a recipe book, if we're honest about what we were in 1820. But it has obviously evolved quite a bit in the 200 years since then. As an organization, USP was based in New York. It was volunteer-based, but the headquarters, there was actual physical location on Park Avenue in New York. I only wish we'd kept the real estate. But in any case, made the right decision in 1950s to move down to Bethesda for a short time and then Rockville, located right down the street from what was the FDA headquarters, and was an obvious move, was the right decision to make. And we've been thriving ever since. It's been about 65 years or so in Montgomery County for USP.
Let's talk a little more background there. How many employees and how many different countries you serve, and sort of this nature of this volunteer organization and how far it reaches.
Yeah. So when USP moved down to the region, we had 2 employees. We had a CEO and I think an assistant. We have grown, that is for sure. We have about 1,300 staff today, most of whom, literally more than half, about 800 or so are based in the US, between Frederick, Maryland, which is a little bit up 270, and then mostly in Rockville, right near the Twin Brook Metro Station.
That's fantastic growth. I don't know if many organizations within our region have had 2 to 1,300 in their growth path, but I know some of these people are located outside of the U.S. as well, because you have several global operation centers, don't you?
Yeah, that's right. And I think another reason it's helpful to be based in such a global hub. Take a step back from health for a moment. DC is a global hub, and that really helps us because we do have offices in about 14, 15 countries now, and the ability to have a headquarters for such a complex operation in a top world metro center is all the difference. And it has been really helpful, really helpful.
And then when you talk about standards, I go into my CVS and I get supplements or something, and I'll see a USP logo on there. I never knew what it meant until I had a chance to meet you or get organized. But talk a little bit about the wide range of standards that USP is involved in and the different types of products that you engage with.
I'll share with you the scope, but then I'll give you one example, a very specific, but I would say ordinary example to make it feel more real. So the scope for USP is quite broad. So it's all medicines. We also play roles in dietary supplements and foods. So it's very, very broad. And by medicine, I mean in the broadest sense, everything from small molecule pills to complex biologics, vaccines. And the role is formal in multiple ways. It's formal that it's written into US law. When the FDA was created back 100 years ago, that same statute and a few others that have followed up since wrote in that the FDA is to enforce on multiple things, but one of which is medicine quality. And in that, they are to use the USP as the basis. And so that's sort of at the heart of it. That was already about halfway through our timeline, about 100 years in. And since that time, of course, that means we're very closely partnered with FDA across all these areas. Now, to make it feel a little less mysterious, in the early days, I mentioned USP was a recipe book. It was, how do you create tincture of opium in 3 parts of this and a couple parts of that, put it in water and mix it up. A little more sophisticated than that, but more or less. Today, it's not that. It's not a recipe book at all. What it actually is a set of analytical tools to measure what you have to ensure that it is what it's supposed to be, that it doesn't contain impurities that it shouldn't, that it will dissolve, or what we say perform, in the way it should when ingested, or that it has sterility, let's say, if it's an injectable. So it's an analytical set of procedures that just says it's what you think. And imagine this is something as a consumer, if you were buying a sweater, you would test these things yourself. Does it feel solid? Do the colors look bright? All the things you could do that you cannot do with a generic medicine. You pick it up and you don't know. All you know is what the label says, and you have no way to test it. But that's what our standards do. They do all of that work so that you can then, by the enforcement of those standards through in the US FDA, and regulators in other countries, to use them. And ultimately, with the exception of dietary supplements, which you can see on the shelf in a drugstore, it's not, the patient doesn't really have to worry about that, or it doesn't have to worry about that. And that's the only way that our system can really operate.
You're using a term now, as you've migrated, of analytic tools. So I would imagine when you look at analytic tools, the profile of the typical worker or employee of USP might have been changed and migrated to based on all of the different forms of analysis that's available today, machine learning, quantum computing, and all of the other things that you have in the information technology world to help you do this analysis.
Yeah, that's insightful, Rich. And actually, it has a secondary effect, which is the same is true for the industry. And by the industry, we mean drug manufacturers. And in the earliest days, we were really talking about pharmacists and physicians. In the earliest days, it was really physicians. But even then, bridging to today, the level of specialization is incredible. So our laboratories we have about half our labs here, about half of our laboratories in our site in India, Hyderabad, India. Our laboratories are stocked with every kind of analytical equipment you could imagine. And they're all to make very specific tests. But I will mention something that it's easy to just take the most expensive new equipment and try to do all your work, but it would be very ineffective for a standard setting organization to create such expensive barriers to medicine production. So what we actually do is we try to figure out what is the most effective standard to create, which involves the tools that you need. Sometimes, like in some work in heparin, for example, where there is a high rate risk of serious adulteration that is only detectable through NMR instrumentation, very expensive instrumentation, then you have to do it. You have no choice. But the vast majority of the time, we can use much less expensive and less technically complex tools so that manufacturers can use it all around the world at a much more reasonable cost and make the medicine availability. So it's a balance of usefulness as well as practicality. As I guess as everything is to some degree in the world, but therefore our labs, which makes it most interesting, is literally we have everything, because we have to have it from the simplest to the most complex in order to create the standard for others to use.
And another element, since you're a global organization, you probably have a chance to monitor what's going on in the pandemic based on all the different countries that your workers are. How has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the effectiveness of USP and your workforce?
Even about a month before COVID was declared a pandemic, because we have a substantial operation in China, our staff were already living. We were living it. And so as an executive, a set of executives here in the US, it was a real benefit for us. We were helping our staff. We were actually sending masks and other equipment from the US to our team in China. And we were learning about COVID. We were much less surprised, not because we're brilliant and genius. We were just living it with our colleagues in China, in Shanghai. And that gave us a little bit of an advantage, like literally weeks. But we said, okay, this is what's probably going to come our way. And here's some of the things we should be thinking about: how to have our staff be remote, thinking about their safety, keeping our labs operational, ensuring we can ship our standards around the world. We ship 800,000 individual reference standards a year around the world to thousands, literally thousands of manufacturers to help them in their analytical tools. We cannot stop. In a pandemic, you don't want to stop the supply of medicine. But finally, the third one is, once we can ensure that the safety and the operations continue, then it's what do we do to help fight this pandemic? How do we join the fight? And that really defined that first part of 2020, was creating that work. And the last thing I can just share is our staff and our volunteers, which are our scientific experts, who not non-paid scientific experts who work on all of our expert committees to set our standards, felt much more empowered by that. And I actually felt for people who were suffering from this and had no active role to fight it, because I would imagine is even more disorienting. There's a purpose, and many in the region, all the biohealth men, had some role to play. And I think that helped with morale and everything else, which was not a small factor in being successful in our work the last couple of years.
Probably there's a few people in DC that could have listened to you early in the pandemic and learned something that could have been applied much sooner if people were in a listening mode.
I don't think we knew all the answers, but we definitely were not kidding ourselves that we were going to escape it for any particular reason.
I'm sure. One of the things that happens in the pharmaceutical and the biomedical area is that innovation is key for all of the major pharmaceutical firms, biotechnology firms, all of the firms producing products, to really look at applying the most current innovation they can in all of their processes. So how does USP and your standards engage in this innovation world? How do you keep track and up to date on everything that's occurring from an innovative standpoint?
Well, there's two kinds of innovation here, completely different kinds. And I'll describe both. They're actually quite different. One, on the one hand, it's literally changes in how things are done. So think about new ways to make vaccines through mRNA technology, an example where we all know now. That's one kind of innovation. Another kind of innovation is how you produce the medicine, for example. So we talked about new analytical methods, maybe things that are less transparent to a patient. But how are the medicines being produced? How is quality being monitored? Maybe how does the supply chain run? That sort of an innovation. We at USP have, until relatively recently, I think, underestimated the role of our standards in the first kind of innovation, the one that most patients think of, a new way to treat disease. And I'll just share a very brief anecdote that was about 2 years ago. I was presenting at Harvard for a meeting, a health forum, And after the meeting, these two young men, they were in their mid-20s. They weren't particularly young until they found out what they were doing. Then they seemed young to me. They approached me and said how they were essentially creating a startup company, and they wanted to talk to me because USP was the only thing they had of certainty in their entire world. And they described their work, and they had this very ambitious idea to fight ALS, which, having worked at Biogen, I know how desperately important, but also how difficult that space is. But, innovation can happen. So I rooted for them. And they shared how our standard, everything was uncertain. How would they get their drug manufactured? How would they get their clinical trials running? Who would fund them? Everything was unknown except one thing. They said, we have our USP book. We open it up. We know exactly how we'll test it. We know exactly how to control sterility. Well, 2 years later, they just had a positive feedback from the FDA. They're starting their phase 3 trial, and it looks pretty exciting. They're coming to speak to our staff. We learned a lot from that moment because we didn't think typically of this kind of cutting edge innovation and the role we play, because we think of ourselves more in the mass production of medicines at scale, thousands of generic molecules, hundreds of millions of doses. But my point being that standards reduce uncertainty, and that can be really helpful in an uncertain world, when there's disruption, when you have high risk in areas like innovation. And so that realization to us has had us shifting our focus as to who we should be talking to and who should be sharing what we have, because unfortunately, some of the leading innovators are the less likely to be aware of USP, because mostly we're being used by the larger companies, if you see what I mean. And the second piece, that was the first kind of innovation. The second one is more obvious. So if there are new analytical tools and there's exciting new work going on, advanced manufacturing techniques that we hear about, maybe to help create some supply chain resilience in our country. There are regulatory barriers, not because the regulator, let's say the FDA, wants to slow it down, but rather it's uncertain. We don't know. How do we use those new tools? Will they be the same as the old tools? And how will we use? Many companies don't want to be first. They want to wait. What can really help is when a standards organization gets out in front on the new technology, creates more certainty, reduces the barrier to entry, and they can come into the new technologies sooner. And those new technologies are often a result of higher quality, lower costs, all the good things we want to see. So 2 kinds of innovation, 2 different approaches, but the realization that a 202-year-old standard-setting organization can help bring forward innovation faster is kind of a novel sounding idea, but one that we're really excited about.
In your description, there's some of the innovation you talked about supply chain. Based on the challenging times we've had over the last couple of years, how resilient has our supply chain been in those areas which are focused?
Yeah, I think there's actually 2 answers to this. On the one hand, it has been quite resilient. The second part of the answer is that there are chronic problems that didn't particularly suffer during the pandemic, but haven't also been resolved. So it's neither in good shape, nor did it break down. So I think what I mean is that the majority of the supply chain is actually pretty resilient, pretty impressive. However, because patients don't take the majority of medicines, there are thousands of them. You don't take 1,000 medicines. You take 2 or 3, maybe 1 is your life-saving medication. If that's in trouble, it doesn't actually help you that the rest of the medicines are resilient. And this is why, unlike, let's say, used cars, a disruption in the supply chain is unacceptable. And a little disruption is still unacceptable. It's what makes it so difficult. So with that said, I participated in the National Council of Pharmaceutical Organizations, NCPO, which is a 103-year-old gathering of the CEOs of all the leading pharmacy and pharmaceutical organizations. So just a small group, 15 or so. And supply chain resilience was on, I think, all but 1 or 2 of the 14 members and their top 3 list for the year, including USP. And it means different things to different. If you're a distributor or a pharmaceutical company or USP, you're defining a different portion for your relevance, but we all mean the same, that the patient can get the medicine they need when they need it. So what are we doing about it? We decided to take a very multi-pronged approach, including a few things that were brand new. So starting 2 years ago, when the supply crunch occurred because of demand spikes mostly, but also exacerbated by flight cancellations, we were aware there were problems. There was a threat to much worse. I was actually really pleased to see mitigations work, not because the danger was exaggerated, but because people took the right action. It was a success in making sure we got through it, but it was a little tight, a little too close for comfort. And so starting at that moment, we've invested quite a few million, not exactly sure how many, but several, to create what I believe, what I'm sure is the first ever global medicine supply map. It is a digital asset. It's quite complex, actually. It's over a dozen data sources, some public, some private, that have all been combined, interlinked, and is searchable. And we call it the medicine supply map. And what it does is let you search down between API and finished dose, right down to the address all around the world. And this is for medicines bound to the US, but of course it's a global map for medicines that are approved for use in the US. To start asking the question, what would happen if there was a hurricane in the Caribbean? Let's say Puerto Rico were to go offline. What if China and the US got into a trade war? What would happen if there were floods in India, fires in the west of the US? By the way, all these things have happened. So these are in theory, we actually have tested a few of these already. And then on top of that, there's secondary pieces that the US government is working on to think about how we create resilience from the bottom up, in a sense, which is how do we create more manufacturing capacity, more agile manufacturing. Our focus at USP is on the advanced manufacturing, and this is one of those innovations, a technology innovation that we're working to build standards to help adoption happen more quickly. And this is actually relevant for the region, the BioHealth region. We've partnered up in Richmond, just down the 95, of course, with a Flow Corporation. It's a for the public corporation. It's basically like a not-for-profit.
For the public good, right?
Public good, yeah, that's right. And they're working under what's a grant from BARDA to create these essential medicines through continuous and advanced manufacturing. We've partnered to create our own lab, USP staff on site. It's at the University of Richmond, actually, facility and campus, where we're going to work alongside on the analytical methods for these and then use that knowledge to write the standards that will enable that kind of advanced manufacturing to be spread across so many more companies. So we're really excited. We're really serious about this. And it's not talk for us. It's real investment and some risks we're taking from a financial perspective because we believe this is really serious.
Well, it's very interesting as you have to look at all of the innovation going on in the industry, which you're monitoring and setting standards for. You're having to go through a reinvention and a re-innovation process for USP to stay with industry as well as to try to get ahead of it in certain areas like the supply chain resiliency. So congratulations to that for being innovative and incorporating other players within the BioHealth Capital Region to be on the forefront of new pioneering innovation, which will benefit everybody.
That's what gets me up every day is that change. So I don't see it as a threat. I see that as sort of a driving motivation.
It's an opportunity, right?
It's an opportunity. I do say that, and this is what's a little bit as a unique as a pharmacopoeia, we do have to innovate, but we have an obligation to maintain. Well, like a library, you're always looking to add new books, but you don't throw away all their other books every year. So we have thousands of standards of medicines that are old medicines like aspirin. Aspirin is important and the standards have to be available and they require updates over time. My point being is that it accumulates and it takes quite a lot of work to just maintain and keep current all of your information you have. And then on top of that to add. And it's a challenge that I really embrace. I'm proud that we're able to do it, but it's one that takes a different approach than I've used to in the private sector where you're much more likely to have your new set of products, you phase out your old products to do the new. And that's not an option for us at USP.
And we're speaking with Dr. Ron Piervincenzi, who's the CEO of US Pharmacopeia. You've been talking about change and innovation, but there's a lot of paradigm shifts occurring within quality and standards. And there have been a number of things that we had a chance to identify getting ready for this BioTalk. And I'd like to do something new with you that I haven't done with other people, but I want to do a rapid fire around these paradigm shifts with you. And I know that might be difficult for you, Ron, because you really like to go into the detail to explain everything that we're talking about. But I'm going to test you on how rapid fire you can be on these 6 different points.
It's the elevator test, right? That's what they said.
Yeah, it's the elevator test. Okay. So let's talk about the shift from U.S. market to global environment to start with.
I think we've woken up and we'll never go back to sleep on this front. People have realized that you can't only think about your country because your components, the pieces, the parts of your medicine are coming from all over. Why is it an innovation? It's more of an innovation than people are realizing it than it happened because it's been true for some time. But there's strength in that diversity too. There are risks, but there's strength in it. So we actually lean into it to say some of that is really helpful. Some of that diversity helps us and builds resilience.
And recognizing that in supply chain and how vulnerable we are is something that's been real over the last 2 years, for sure. Second, compliance-driven to integrated risk-based approaches.
A lot of words there. What it basically means is the world isn't so simple, and most medicines are not either. And when you get to your less simple medicines, you don't have a green light, red light. It's not so simple. And so risk-based approaches are, I could test every single product that comes off the line, but no one would get medicine because if it was all tested, you destroy it in testing, nobody can take the medicine. So how much do we test? In what ways? At what points in time? And not only do you make those decisions, but in a risk-based approach, you make them and you automatically change based on what you learned. So the more problems you find, the more testing is required or the more changes. And the less you find, the more quickly you can keep moving. That's all it means is risk-based. And it sounds obvious and logical, but from a regulatory and compliance standpoint, people have traditionally preferred simple binary, I do this and it's okay. Risk-based approaches take more thinking, more tracking, and more analysis. So it's better, but it is proving to take longer to make the conversion in the medical industry, as opposed to other consumer goods, auto manufacturing, the airlines. They've all made this transition faster.
Next one is something we talked about briefly, and that's traditional manufacturing to new manufacturing approaches like advanced manufacturing and some of the programs you're involved in.
So the basics is that the new manufacturing techniques have advantages both in cost and quality for many uses. And I'd just be clear, not for all. Sometimes the old version of manufacturing, which is batch manufacturing, is wonderfully effective, but within it, there are new technologies. So I wanted to separate because some people just assume it's the entire thing or not, but there's a lot of nuance in between. And there are more advanced analytical methods within the older method, within the older institutions, which means you can upgrade even in your existing infrastructure. So we look at this quite broadly and believe that there's huge opportunity for cost and speed, which has impact on resilience, but also on access. And not just in the US, but in other countries where $1 a dose for a medicine might be prohibitive.
How about the shift from prescriptive to flexible performance and outcomes?
This is very USP-centric, or I should say quality-centric. The way I would say this is a traditional USP test will tell you, run this analysis, and if you have your answer within this range, you're in good shape. And if you're not, you're not. In a performance test, again, this is where that is not possible. It's always great if you just have a simple answer. It's not always possible. If you have a gene in cell therapy, let's give you an example. It's your cells. There's no way anyone has ever developed a test for your cells because they've never had your cells before. So instead, what we call performance tests, you test the performance of the whole system around it to maximize the chance that your unique personalized medicine will be effective for you. I think it's more logical when you think of it that way. You think, of course, I can't test your cells and say it should look like this because your cells are not mine.
It gets back down to personalized medicine too then.
That's absolutely.
Next would be product testing to quality by design with quality organizations.
Quality by design is not a new concept. And for many in our industry, we're quite aware of it. You build in the quality to the system. You don't test it at the end, which means if it comes out and it's okay, it must be okay. In quality by design, that's not true. It's not good enough to just be okay, because if your system is not designed the right way, the second pill that comes out might not be okay. So how do you create quality by design incentives requires also things like performance standards so that the manufacturers who move this direction are incentivized to do so. Currently, what some of the activities that would lead in those directions are actually disincentivized unintentionally by costs and other barriers.
Really, the last paradigm to talk about, even though it's not the last, there's many more, is really something that's obvious. And it's really the reactive versus proactive continuous improvement.
So some of this comes down to cost. If you build a manufacturing plant for you run through your R&D, you develop a new drug, you create your manufacturing plant, which has a 15-year life. You get your approval from the regulatory authority to make a drug in a certain way, and you start to produce it. Anything you do from that moment to improve could cost you more money. Everything you do might require you to change that factory that you've already built, to file more paperwork with FDA to show them how your process has changed. So right now, there are natural disincentives to continuous improvement. You might wait 15 years later and then improve for your next medicine, but that's not continuous improvement at all. And so how do you encourage, that's the idea of performance. What are the changes that you're able to make that you actually can incentivize those improvements and create the standards that give you safe spaces in which to make those improvements? It's the simplest way to describe it.
Well, thank you for the rapid fire on the paradigm shifts. And I know that we could talk about this for the whole BioTalk. And maybe we can go deeper next time we talk and the next year. But let's talk about some things more locally about the BioHealth Capital Region. When it moved from New York down to Maryland area, Maryland wasn't as robust as it is today, or the BioHealth Capital Region or Montgomery County. And you probably have the ability, you could operate anywhere in the world you want to because you have 15 different operations. What keeps the headquarters for USP in Rockville, in Montgomery County, and what can we look forward to in the future around that potential growth or evolution?
The only reason, it was a big one, but the reason USP came here was to be adjacent to FDA. It actually is still our biggest partner in the world. Over 150 staff members at FDA participate on USP's expert committees, and that's just the day-to-day work. There's other interactions above that, hundreds of people. So it's fantastic. And that's frankly might be enough reason to stay here anyway, even if only that. However, you're right. Things have changed dramatically in our region. We're excited about the strength of the bio-innovation sector in particular, because so much of our focus and our priorities for the next 5 years is in standard setting in that space where we have so many collaborators right up the 270 corridor, right through here. But I want to mention another thing in our region, which is Washington, D.C. That has proven to be an increasingly important part. And it was relevant. USP's founding, in fact, was in the U.S. Senate chamber on January 1st, 1820. It was not lost on the founders of USP, even then, the importance of advocacy and recognition, and therefore being heard. So that continues to be important, but in much more sophisticated ways now. Every topic we've talked about here with innovation and supply chain resilience, they all have political aspects. They all have funding challenges and other roles that USP is often brought in as an expert to share our views. So being right here in DC has proven to be more important in the last 5 years than perhaps ever before.
And more important in the future too.
Yeah. So you think of that. So you have bioinnovation from an industry's perspective. You have FDA, and to a lesser degree for us, but important also NIH, in particular NIH and NIST, which is even closer to us. And then third, DC. That's extraordinary. I mean, so for us, look, this is an easy call for us. I mean, this is so obviously the right place to be, but I think it's also the right for even others for some subset of those same reasons.
So I guess if we look at the FDA and if we ever hear a hint that they might move, then we should be concerned about USP moving. But right now, I don't think that's going to happen.
No, I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're happy in White Oak for some time, although they could use some more parking, but that's an issue that's been, I think, somewhat alleviated by more remote working.
Yeah, I think that's probably being addressed. But, since we talked last January, there's two events I'd like to talk to you about, or things that have happened or will happen in the region that are pretty impressive. And one is there was a new initiative created in the region, which fortunately I always had a chance to be involved with, which was working with Connected DMV and Stu Solomon on the creation of a global pandemic prevention and biodefense center, which was going to operate a little differently than anybody else in this pandemic prevention space, because it was going to engage industry, academia, NGOs, and the government working together, where any of the other entities never had all four of those partners involved. And they needed a place to locate. Fortunately, they got a chance to meet you and Tony Lakavage from USP and made a decision, and you made an offer they couldn't refuse. Tell me about that.
That's right. The best kind of offers you can't refuse are lasagna and a room to sleep in, right?
And a free room to sleep in. But the Global Pandemic Center is co-located, and their global headquarters is now at USP. Congratulations on that.
We're proud to have them. We brought it back and said, why not? We had some space right in our meeting center that we said, look, we can just refurbish this in a few weeks' time, and then it's yours. And I know from a startup, I worked, especially in my days at McKinsey, working with startups, you have a lot to worry about. And paying rent is one that if you don't have to worry about it, that would be lovely. So I said, great. We don't have the ability, like a private industry as a nonprofit, a self-supported nonprofit, to make large donations and such things. But here was something we could do, and that we were proud of. I will say that I'm really excited for their mandate. I think there's potential well beyond the initial scope of the work. We're actively supporting the looking for additional funding, including from federal government. And so, we're serious about it. And we think USP has a direct role to play, in addition to just being a nice neighbor.
I agree. And if you can find another $2.5 billion laying around, they would really appreciate that, Ron. The second thing is that because of our relationship between BioHealth Innovation and USP, which has really sprung in 2021, we were looking for some new partners and some homes for our BioHealth Capital Region Forum, which has become sort of the leading industry confab in our region. And we're looking at our 8th coming up this September. And unfortunately, AstraZeneca was our home for that. And they've made a decision in 2022, they're not going to have any major large outside groups. So Tony, who is a board member on BHI from USP, and I had a discussion, and he said, we might be able to be an alternative for you. And so through those discussions, we're engaged in dialogue right now to host what we would classify a hybrid, but hopefully more in-person than virtual 8th Annual BioHealth Capital Region Forum at USP on September 20th and 21st of 2022. So Ron, we really appreciate your stepping up and your willingness to be a partner in this, because you have a fantastic facility. And I think also you and I have talked, it may be a way for also creating greater awareness for the USP brand, the organization, and ways for your people to interact with other people within the region.
Appreciate your trust in having us host. We're proud of it. We're fortunate we call it the meeting center. Because of our volunteer model, we have 800 scientific experts who convene across 27 committees around every kind of medicine you can think of to set our standards. And so we have a center because they're constantly having meetings, including an auditorium for larger groups and talks. But we also, which is exciting, is we renovated our lobby, the entire lobby, and turned it inside out, meaning that now it's our museum. It sounds weird to have a museum as a nonprofit, but 202 years old, you actually have some pretty good stuff. So we're excited about it. We love to be able to tell our story, not because what happened 200 years ago is important, but because our mission is exactly the same, it actually simplifies a bit to be able to tell the story and makes you really proud of this region and the role it's played globally in setting what is our medicine supply today.
The other thing is that there's probably a lot of people with your museum and with your organization, with the locals or people coming to the region who are unfamiliar with it. And this will be great to have a different venue with a different look and feel, rather than the traditional thing that we do is, you go into an auditorium, there's not much else other than an auditorium and people interacting with one another. So I think it's going to be a welcome change. And we think it's something we can continue to build on in the future for maybe some other events that might emerge. In closing, why don't you talk a little bit about what you see as the future for your USP goals beyond 2022 and what do we have to look forward?
I'll use it as a way, trying to bring up brand new things we haven't discussed, because I don't need to. A focus on innovation in areas of both of complex generics and biosimilars. It's the medicine that more and more, is becoming available to people all around the world. And we're going to be focusing on those to create the standards even ahead of the demand, so manufacturers have what they need to solve the problems they have to produce those medicines. That's one of our priorities. The second is supply chain resilience. And the two things I mentioned earlier and others that we're working on directly, all with partners. In fact, I don't think any of these we do alone. I'm all with partners. And a third dimension for us is advocacy for global access to quality medicines. And this involves very different kinds of work in lower income countries, including in lower income countries, to help build the capacity of regulators to approve medicines and to make sure they don't become the dumping grounds for poor quality, just like the US was in 1820. As much as things have changed, some of the same trends can occur if we're not careful. So we have teams and offices around the world, over $100 million program with the US government for funding to do this capacity building work around the world. We're super proud of that work with USAID. And so that becomes that kind of capacity building, that capability building is what we call it internally, is sort of our third focus area as we look forward.
It's not like you don't have a full plate already, Ron, but I'm sure your associates at USP are excited to hear about all of these new things you'd like to work on when they're already busy doing everything that they're doing already, huh?
There is that, but fortunately we're hiring. We have over 100 job openings at the moment. So go to our website.
Let us know about those 100 openings, because we have a jobs board on our website. And then also, if you would like, prepare a little article. We'll put it in our BHI News, in our weekly electronic newsletter, about your 100 job openings that you're looking for. And we could actually do a feature on that. I think that would be great.
It would be wonderful. It's an exciting time for us in hiring, and as it is for many organizations in the world today. I'll leave it at that.
And we're challenged a little bit. We've been talking about workforce in our region. And since there's been so much money flowing into our region, federal money related to the pandemic, and them having to serve, the government contracts and meet their milestones, it's just challenging for everybody to keep up with the workforce demands they have to meet all of those milestones that they're expected to.
Yeah, and it isn't even just pandemic related. I mean, you have growth in staff at FDA, for example, just for ordinary reasons, if you want to call it that, but it all adds up to quite an extraordinary moment.
Well, this has been very educational for me. Every time I interact with you, I learn a lot more, and we're just touching the surface and something that we should do on a more regular basis, which we will. So I want to thank Dr. Ron Piervincenzi, the CEO of USP, for his second appearance on BioTalk, and it won't be the last. And Ron, keep up the great work and becoming a stalwart within the BioHealth Capital Region.
Thank you, Rich. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.